To use the large Synclastic former to form a Synclastic bracelet, you want to choose metal that is about 16 gauge to 24 gauge. And it's easier to form and you'll get better curvature if you use annealed metal. This is 16 gauge and it's straight off the rolling mill. I did anneal it so that it's pretty soft. This is going to give you the biggest curve, the nicest Synclastic form. Before you use it, make sure that you insert the urethane holder with no spacer. This is for the large Synclastic. You do not want to put a spacer on the urethane holder before you insert it. And then you want to mount the large Synclastic former to the 4th hole in the tool mounting plate. To form your metal, you want to make sure that your metal strip is centered on the former, and you want to raise the urethane and then you insert your metal so that the end of it is about at the midway point of the urethane holder. The goal is to form the end of the strip first. After your metal is centered, you don't want it angled this way, angled toward the back. You want it straight and parallel to the former itself. Use the handle and press down to form the very end of the strip. So let's take a look. You can see that has begun to form a nice Synclastic curve. We'll put the metal back in, and then you want to scoot it forward maybe an 1/8 of an inch to a 1/16 of an inch. You'll have to figure out what works best for you, but you want to take itty bitty tiny steps forward to avoid any creases in the metal. So to move forward, you just slide it this direction on the former. Again, make sure your metal is parallel to the former. Press again. And then you just inch forward, taking these little tiny bites. You can go back over the same areas more than once. Let me do a little bit more and I will show you where we're at. We have a nice Synclastic curve starting to form. I'm going to form about half of this cuff bracelet and then we'll take a look at it and I will show you where we're at. You can see I'm making small adjustments as I'm scooting it forward. If I notice that I've taken too big of a step, I'll slide it back. You can also slightly rotate it, towards the front of the former or towards the back. Okay, let's stop there and take a look. The Synclastic curve is coming along quite nicely. The edge is nice and smooth. The surface of the metal, it's been formed evenly, and it didn't really take much effort at all. There is this spot here, if you can see it. The metal's a little flatter here, and there's sort of this raised point right about here. I'm going to show you how to fix that. If there are any areas like that you want to smooth out, insert the metal back into the former, and then instead of keeping your metal perfectly parallel to the former, slightly rotate it back. And what this does is it pushes this edge onto a higher part of the former. So you will be able to flatten and smooth out that small area that seemed a little sharp. Area that was slightly pointed, it's nice and smooth now. Now I'm going to show you what happens when you take too big of steps. Insert the metal and make sure the end is fairly centered on the urethane and centered on the former itself. So we're going to press the first time, and then instead of scooting it forward just a tiny bit, we're going to move it forward, say 3/4 of an inch or so. This is too far, and I'll show you what this looks like after a few more presses. So again, we'll scoot this forward more than we need to, press it again, scoot it forward more than we should, press it again, scoot it forward, and press it again. Let's take a look. The side on the left is the side that I formed, taking the small steps nice and smooth, nice and even. This side, it isn't formed as tightly, and there are these distinct points. You can see where each bend was each time I pressed. So there's a point here, the metal's kind of flat, then there's a raised area, flat, raised area, then flat. You can fix this though. So if you do take too big of steps, you can put your metal back in, make small adjustments, take tiny little steps. You can also slide your metal toward the back. You can tilt it toward the front if you need to smooth out any of the edges. And then just keep taking these tiny little nibbles until you form the entire cuff with no ridges or flat areas. You can go back over the same areas. So let's say right here, there's a little bit of a point. I'm going to angle it back. We'll flatten that bit. When you're finished forming the metal, take the handle off and set it aside, and then grab the cuff with your fingers and slide it forward. And it will pop right off. Then to open the cuff, insert 2 fingers on either side of the opening. Make them so that they're fairly evenly spaced, and then gently pull the ends apart. You want about an inch opening, and here is your cuff. This is a piece of full hard 16 gauge copper. So I want to show you how this compares to the sample that we just made using annealed 16 gauge copper. So this is straight out of the rolling mill, very hard. We're going to start it the same way. Insert the metal to about the midway point of the urethane. Make sure that the strip is centered front to back. And we're going to press. You can see here, it has begun to form, but the curve is definitely not as defined as if the metal were annealed. Let's move forward. I'm going to keep taking these small steps, just as we did when the metal was annealed. You can see the curve is, it's still curving, but it's not as pronounced or as deeply rounded as the sample I made with the annealed metal. Now let's say that your metal is wider than 1 inch. So the forming area of the large synclastic former is 1 inch, but you can use slightly wider material. This is about 1.5 inches wide, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. And if you form it just straight down the center of the former, you'll end up with a ridge down the center. And I'm going to do that first, and then I'll show you how to fully round out the entire width of the metal using the same former. So it starts the same. This is 16 gauge annealed copper. Trying to keep it as centered as I can as I'm feeding it into the press. Take a few more steps. I'm taking larger steps than I would usually because of how we're going to continue forming. Let's get the center section formed. Okay, so it's not complete. I stopped forming about here. But you can see how there's just this one ridge sort of in the center where the edges are flared out and a little flat. If we want to make that side look like this, where it's a nice smooth curve across the entire surface, I like to call it like free forming. I don't know if that's the technical term for it, but instead of feeding the metal straight in, I'm going to feed the metal front and back as well as side to side as I'm pressing. And this will evenly form the entire surface, the entire width of the metal blank. So you can see I'm sort of rotating it toward me, rotating it back away from me. Same thing. It takes a little longer, but it allows you to form slightly wider strips. You can see this side is formed pretty well. This side is still a little flat. So what I'm going to do, I had been forming it with this end pointed that direction. I'm going to flip it around so that I'll be able to tilt it more toward me. So you will just continue working that metal. More toward you. And this is just sort of a back and forth game. You move it, take a look at it, make adjustments as needed. Make sure your fingers stay out of the way, but because it's a manual press, as long as you don't stick your fingers under there, you're not going to pinch your fingers. We'll keep nibbling away. And there we go. That has begun to form. So this section here, I have moved it back and forth. I have free-formed the surface of the cuff, whereas this section here, from about here, you can see that pronounced ridge, and that was just forming straight down the center of the strip. Using the free-form method allows you to form slightly wider strips than what we recommend. I would say 1 inch to about 1.5 inches wide.